Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our FASEB webinar series on animal research regulations. We'll get started here at the top of the hour. Just sit tight as we wait for everyone else to sign in and join us. So we'll be starting shortly. All right, so it is 2 o'clock, and I guess we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you that are joining us on the West Coast. Welcome to part 2 of the FASEB webinar series on animal research regulations. In today's webinar, which is titled The Role of IACUC and AAALAC in Animal Research Oversight, The speakers will explain some of the other oversight mechanisms that guide and inform research with laboratory animals. This includes institutional animal care and use committees, as well as the organization known as AAALAC. My name is Naomi Harlem-Bacchus, and I'm a senior science policy analyst here at FASEB, and I'm really excited to dive into this very important topic with you guys today. So good science and good animal care go hand in hand. We all know that. And as scientists, it's our responsibility to know and understand how animal research is regulated to ensure that animals are properly cared for. Last week, we unpacked and discussed what the Animal Welfare Act is, along with the Public Health Service Policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals. And if you're tuning in this week, it's highly likely that you have heard of these laws already. Today, we will explore another part of the oversight mechanisms, and that has to do with AAALAC and IACUC and how they are involved in making sure that animals are taken care of throughout the research process. I want to assure everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email once the recording is up on the FASEB website. That PowerPoint slides are also going to be available. So with that being said, we will have time for questions at the end. Please try and save your questions at the end. We will get to all of them as best we can. To ask a question, you there should be a box on your side of the screen where you type in your question and you click send. I will receive it on my end, and we will read each question in the order they are received. I also want to remind everyone, if we don't have time to get through all of the questions, I will compile all of the questions I receive and make sure that they're distributed to the speakers and that they answer them on their own time, and we will post those answers on the website. So to kick things off, those are our speakers. So this is how to ask a question. Whoopsie, we had a switcheroo of the slides there. Just as I said, type in your questions. And to kick things off, I wanted to ensure that we're all on the same page here, regardless of your background or familiarity with animal research regulations. I wanted to provide some context for this FASEB webinar series. So this flowchart provides a high-level view of what we've been discussing the last couple of weeks. When we say animal research regulations, that is broadly referring to two policies, the Animal Welfare Act and the Public Health Service, or PHS, policy, which is under the Health Research Extension Act. We learned about those details of those laws last week in the webinar. Now, two different federal agencies are responsible for enforcing these laws, as you can see from the arrows pointing down. The Animal Welfare Act is enforced by the United States Department of Agriculture, specifically the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or USDA ACES. The PHS policy is enforced by the National Institutes of Health Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, NIH-OLAF. Now, last week, as I said, we learned how these agencies enforce these laws to make sure animal welfare is maintained. Both of these laws, though, require research laboratories to stand up institutional animal care and use committees, or IACUCs, as you can see from both arrows pointing toward it. This committee also oversees the conduct of research being done at the facilities, but alongside these laws, agencies and committees like AAALAC, which stands for the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care, also play into this. This is a private organization that provides independent accreditation to animal care programs across the research spectrum. And in order to earn AAALAC accreditation, institutions have to demonstrate that they have a rigorous animal program that abides by the provisions set forth by the Animal Welfare Act and PHS policy. So today we're going to learn more about IACUC and AAALAC's role and responsibility in animal research. So hopefully this flowchart provides some context for what we will be diving into these last couple weeks. So I'm really excited about our speakers today. First up is Dr. Galen Edwards from the University of Georgia, who's the chair of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee at his institution. Take it away, Galen.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. And my charge today is to provide some insight into why we have IACUCs, a few hot button issues that they focus on, and then reflect on a couple common misconceptions about IACUCs. And if I could go to the next slide, please. So as Naomi just pointed out, an IACUC is required by the Animal Welfare Act and by the Public Health Service policy. This is true in the United States, but similar oversight bodies are required globally. The membership of the IACUC is appointed by the CEO or a person delegated to perform this function. That's true for all IACUCs. And membership must include a properly trained veterinarian and a person not affiliated with the institution who doesn't use laboratory animals. Now, the size of the committee may vary. The Animal Welfare Act requires at least 3 people, while the Public Health Service requires at least 5. Generally, it's more than this. I've seen committees as large as 20. That becomes a bit cumbersome, but it's not unusual to have committees of 10 to 15 people. If I could go to the next slide, please. So a few hot button issues that IACUCs routinely deal with, and I've been an IACUC chair now for over 20 years, so I've seen many protocols come across my desk. There are a few things I'd like to point out today that I've encountered in my experience that are common problems with animal care protocols. First up is everybody on the proposal is properly trained. Really, everybody needs to be trained in the techniques they will be using. For example, if you're going to do surgery, you must demonstrate that you know how to do proper surgical techniques. If you're even going to bleed animals, you must demonstrate that you're able to bleed them or have some documentation that you have been properly trained. Secondly, the goals of the protocol should be easily understandable. Remember that we have community members on our IACUCs that have to understand what's going on in your proposal. And this often starts with a well-written lay summary that really lays out why you're doing the project, what your goal is in doing the project. You have to justify your animal numbers. And I'm going to come back to this at the end, toward the end of my section of the talk, but you need to make sure that you have adequate numbers of animals in your protocol. And this would include animals that you may anticipate will be unusable. If you're doing vaccine trials, maybe some of the animals you receive are already immune, and those would not be animals that could be used in your trial, and you would have to eliminate them. But you have to understand that those animals won't be there and justify the appropriate numbers of animals in the protocol. Also, you must demonstrate that alternatives to the animal research are not available. For USDA species, this requires a literature search, but for all species, the IACUC does require that you do some type of demonstration that alternatives to the animal studies aren't available. If I could go to the next slide, please. Probably the area that is hardest for both the IACUC and the investigator are really getting the techniques that involve animals across as clear and easy to follow. In infectious disease studies or cancer disease studies, if you know the course of the disease, describe that. That helps the IACUC understand how the disease will progress. Some diseases, for example, have very rapid onsets. High path flu would be an example where animals will become ill within a day or so. And you can contrast that with more insidious diseases like tuberculosis, which may take weeks or even longer before the disease actually expresses itself. And the IACUC needs to understand that so that they know how to review your document and make sure that your endpoints are appropriate. If you're doing surgery, this is another area that IACUCs often have a hard time understanding what the PI is trying to do or understanding if the PI is actually appropriately trained. You do need to use proper technique. That includes preparing the animal properly, making sure that all the instruments and the field are all sterile. A lot of focus on anesthesia and analgesia. Is the anesthetic appropriate to the surgery? A lot more focus today on analgesic regimens. It is very common for IACUCs to expect that analgesia be on board before the surgery is actually initiated. So perioperative analgesia, and in addition to postoperative analgesia, is very important. Postoperative monitoring. If you're doing really serious surgical techniques, you may need to monitor the animals every 4 to 6 hours for the first 24 to 48 hours. It's not appropriate to say, oh, we'll just come back in the morning and see if they're doing okay. If it's appropriate to monitor every 4 hours, you need to monitor every 4 hours. And then also euthanasia, and this is something that a lot of IACUCs spend a good bit of time talking about, especially when we talk about endpoints, and that is to make sure that the euthanasia is appropriate to the species. And we generally follow the AVMA's guidelines for euthanasia, but and so it's probably important that you follow those as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Other areas that we focus on are the drugs that you're using. Make sure that your drug doses are appropriate and consistent throughout the document. I've seen many instances where cut and paste errors may have multiple doses of a drug listed throughout a protocol. And given that, it's probably a good idea to give yourself a range of doses as you prepare your protocol, so that if you have to adjust the dose, you don't have to submit an amendment to have the dose approved. Also, if you can, see if you can get classes of drugs approved. A good example are alpha-2 agonists. A few years back, there was a shortage of xylazine, and we were scrambling to get many amendments in to use another alpha-2 agonist. So those are things to consider. One of the biggest issues we face in the IACUC I-Chair are endpoints. We have many infectious disease protocols, and endpoint is always an issue, particularly for vaccine trials. So you need to provide some evidence that the endpoint you are proposing is appropriate. And that may mean that the endpoint would seem pretty extreme, but in many vaccine trials, the animal can become very ill and the vaccine is still effective. And so you need to provide documentation that that is true. And as I mentioned earlier, be willing to increase the monitoring of the animals if you have knowledge of the disease course. So if you know that the disease is becoming very serious at day 10, you would want to propose that you increase the monitoring of the animal at maybe day 8 or 9, so that you can catch that animal when it is when its welfare is most compromised. Next slide, please. IACUCs also need very sound veterinary advice, and this is where the attending veterinarian comes in. Both the Public Health Service, OLA, and the Animal Welfare Act require that the IACUC must have a veterinarian with direct program authority and responsibility for animal-related activities. This is mandated by law, and if I could have the next slide. But the attending veterinarian has many different duties and may wear many different hats. They do need to be an IACUC member, but their duties may include oversight, direct oversight of the animal care program, or maybe not. They may be more involved with the administrative side of the program. In my experience, the attending veterinarian often serves as the liaison between the animal care program, and that would include the IACUC, the institutional official, and the regulatory agency. So they really are at the crux of the animal care program at an institution, and very important to the function of that overall animal care program. The other thing that people sometimes confuse with the attending veterinarian as defined legally, the attending veterinarian may not have direct clinical care duties. That may be delegated to other veterinarians in the program. So in terms of being the direct attending veterinarian, that isn't always the case. It could be they are, but in many cases they're not. Their role, though, is very, very important. Then I'd like to wrap up with 3 common misconceptions. Now, there are lots of common misconceptions. I can assure you that I've had many people tell me what's wrong with our IACUC in the last 20-some years, but I've kind of boiled it down to 3 things that I think people often think the IACUC does. And first off is the IACUC wants the fewest numbers of animals in my protocol, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. And in my decades now on an IACUC, I can count on one hand the number of times we've sent a protocol back because we thought it was requesting too many animals. Too often, the truth is the they're requesting too few animals. What we want to find is the right number of animals. And again, you need to justify your animal use in your protocol and request that many animals. We really do think that you need to have rigorous studies. The second thing that IACUCs are often thought to kind of demand too much is asking for too many details. And really what the IACUC wants is that you focus on details that impact animal welfare. Often we'll get long details of experimental techniques, like how you might be developing some probe or some viral vector. We're not as much interested in that as we are in how the injection of that vector would affect the animal's health. And remember that what you tell the IACUC needs to be understandable by the general public. Again, we have community members on our IACUC. We really do need to have what you're proposing understandable by our community members. And then finally, I'm often told that the IACUC just doesn't understand my position as a PI. Remember, the IACUC is primarily composed of your colleagues, your faculty and scientist friends that you see in the hall every day. So they are writing proposals, they are submitting AUPs. So they do understand your position. And with that, I thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to questions at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Galen. That was really great. I think it's important to touch on the common misconceptions we have. I mean, it all goes back to, we need to make sure we have rigor and reproducibility in our studies. So that also ties into the animal programs at institutions. All right, moving on. Our next talk will be from Dr. Alice Long from the Department of Veterans Affairs. She spoke with us last week and provided the perspective of the VA and how they enforce the laws for animal welfare, but now she's going to touch on how the IACUC plays a role in this as well.
Thank you, Naomi. So I'm from the Office of the Chief Veterinary Medical Officer, or the CVMO, which is Dr. Michael Fallon, who directs the program of research with animals at the VA. So my role is to provide guidance to the IACUCs at the 70-plus individual VA stations, mostly about what it means in practical terms when we say that VA has a stated commitment to meeting the highest ethical and regulatory standards for research with animals. One of the ways that I do that is through a brush-up workshop that I conduct with IACUC members at individual VA stations. Because the vast majority of what VA requires for oversight of research with animals is the same as what most other U.S. research institutions are required to do, most of what the workshop covers also applies to any other IACUC. And that's why Naomi asked me to provide some thoughts today about the role of the IACUC. Dr. Edwards just talked about some important specifics of what the IACUC is supposed to pay attention to. So I'm going to focus instead on why the IACUC and what it pays attention to are actually important. I hope this perspective will be helpful to both those of you who are involved in the work of the IACUC and those of you who work under the oversight of an IACUC. For the IACUC to be effective and efficient in doing all the things it's supposed to do, and some of these are shown in the lower bubble in this figure, it helps to consider where the supposed to comes from. Of course, the obvious response is that the supposed to comes from the regulatory requirements that apply to research with animals. Those were the focus of the webinar that we did last week. And these include the USDA Animal Welfare Act and regulations, the PHS policy, VA policy, and I'm also including the AAALAC rules of accreditation here, even though they're not actually regulatory, and Dr. Bain is going to talk more about those later. They are practical measures to help promote ethical conduct of research with animals. So what sometimes gets lost is that these regulatory requirements are just a way to meet the dual ethical requirements. So one of those is that it is often a moral imperative to perform research or testing on animals before subjecting humans to new procedures, pharmacologics, or devices. And this was articulated in the Nuremberg Code back in 1947, which was drafted in response to what the world learned about what the Nazis had done. On the other hand, it is also an ethical imperative to look out for the welfare of the animals, which is a foundational principle of the PHS policy. So meeting the regulatory requirements turns out to be a way to demonstrate to the public that the research meets the ethical requirements. And that's important because much of the research that's done is done with public funds. So those who do the research have an obligation to give the public reason to trust that the funds are being used appropriately. IACUC oversight is the mechanism that the regulatory requirements prescribe. We tend to focus on the top part of this drawing, that the IACUC and its responsibilities are just requirements of the regulatory language. But I'd like to focus on the bottom of the drawing, which is that the point of the regulatory language is to promote ethical conduct of research. That's the real reason that we need IACUCs. So looking at the IACUC from this perspective helps to make much more sense of what it is and what it does. I like to think of an IACUC as being analogous to a jury in the American legal system. So it's a group of people who are peers in some sense with the people whose work they oversee. The people have different knowledge, experience, and points of view, and they're not expected to be legal or regulatory experts, but they are expected to exercise judgment about how the legal or regulatory requirements apply. One difference between an IACUC and a jury is that the IACUC doesn't just hand down verdicts. The IACUC actually works with everyone else to make the program work, to get the research done in compliance with the ethical and regulatory requirements. For this system to work, the IACUC members have to do a few things. Each member has to fully engage in the deliberations. The whole idea of trial by jury or oversight by IACUC is that no single person can be counted on to know best. So it's really essential that every member both speaks up and listens. Every member has to make informed judgments about the matters, and the matters are usually not black and white. The members have to weigh the relative importance and significance of conflicting factors and decide what's appropriate or what's enough. Then each member has to vote his or her own conscience and not just go along with what somebody else on the committee thinks. And then, of course, every member has to help with documenting what the IACUC does, because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So I'd like to consider how this applies to some of the things that the IACUC does. One of the main tasks that the IACUC is responsible for is protocol review. For these, thinking about the IACUC in terms of its role to support and demonstrate the ethical conduct of research moves us away from looking at protocol review as just another impediment to research. The job of the IACUC is to use informed judgment to help the PI make sure that the proposed protocol meets regulatory and ethical requirements and documents that clearly. Because the goal is to help the PI, the part about being informed is important. The IACUC has the collective experience of its members to draw on, expertise of its members, and also is encouraged to consult with others. So some protocols will benefit from having some outside veterinary, scientific, or statistical input about specific procedures. Or it can be really useful to consult with the oversight entities for guidance into what the requirements actually mean. That would include USDA, OLA, AAALAC, and if you're in the VA, our office. It can also actually be very valuable for the IACUC and the PI to talk, to remember that they're not adversaries in this protocol review process. And the PI really is the one who knows best what is intended and why. And this can be done one-on-one. Sometimes the PI might meet with an IACUC member, or the PI can be invited to meet with the committee at a meeting. Another one of the tasks that demand a lot of the IACUC attention is the semi-annual evaluations. Here again, it's easy to think of these as mainly a burden that's imposed by the regulatory requirements, but they actually have a role in making sure that the ethical requirements continue to be met as things change over time. Whatever was fine 6 months ago might not still be fine now. So we have evolving ethical standards, we have new guidance coming out all the time, we have changing technology and research needs, and the existing infrastructure and equipment in the facility ages. So it makes sense then that USDA requires at least 2 IACUC members on each evaluation subcommittee, because this gives the committee the benefit of more eyes looking and seeing different things. The same principle applies to involving different people each time, even if you, for species that are not regulated by USDA, you're only required to have one person. Involving fresh eyes offers benefits along the same lines because it's natural not to see things that you're familiar with. So it makes the semi-annual evaluations more meaningful and useful if the non-affiliated and non-scientific members are involved. If members inspect areas that they don't usually use when they're doing their work, or when members try to approach the process as if they're evaluating a station they're not familiar with. Also, for the sake of making the process meaningful and useful, it can be valuable to invite non-members to participate. These can be people who conduct research with animals but aren't members of the IACUC. They can provide insight into how things are actually working or what is needed to make them work better. The animal facility supervisor may or may not be an appointed voting member, but can be very valuable to have along on facility inspections. You might want to invite people from other services, the engineering service or the housekeeping service, who can advise on the feasibility of corrective actions that the IACUC might think about. And then once in a while, it's useful to invite individuals with authority to make things happen. You can have various administrators of the IO because they may benefit from seeing firsthand what the situation is on the ground. The process of conducting a semi-annual evaluation can be meaningful and useful when it's conducted to be so. So there's generally some kind of a form involved, and most forms include some kind of a checklist. And that often winds up being the main focus of the IACUC's attention. When this gets addressed as just another regulatory hurdle, it kind of degenerates into permission to ignore everything else, or a game of legal interpretation, or it could be a challenge, how do we avoid self-incriminating, or it can be a list of options because we have to confess to something. But actually it can be useful if it's used as a list of prompts about what needs attention. What's more important than what's noted on the checklist, though, is what the IACUC then does with the observations, and that's the second bullet point here. The IACUC has to investigate, deliberate, and use judgment to figure out how to respond, to use the observations to improve the program. For example, if the IACUC finds an animal that doesn't have food, just giving it some food without any further analysis of the situation would address the immediate finding, but it might mess up the study if the animal's actually on an approved fast. Sorting out why there was no food gives the IACUC a chance to figure out whether there might be a weakness in, for example, how the husbandry personnel are trained or scheduled, or maybe there's a problem with the ordering or storage mechanisms for food in the facility. And either of those could result in much bigger failures, but if they get noticed when there's a small failure, they can be taken care of and the bigger failures can be avoided. Now, if we go one step further than that, beyond figuring out how to address the individual findings, actually the most important part of this whole process is the third step, which is in the biggest font. Figuring out what all of it together means for the program as a whole. And this is kind of the answer to the question, so what? And then documenting, of course. So we want to document that for the IO. Sometimes this gets treated as busy work to meet the regulatory requirements. You know, we've done all the work, found out the checklist, and set up all the corrective actions, and then we need to fill in some text for this document. But if we keep in mind that the regulatory requirements are really a way of promoting the ethical conduct of research, this becomes a chance to actually put things into perspective so that all the parties involved can work together to make the animal research program better. One more task that demands a lot of IACUC attention is addressing concerns that come up, which sometimes means self-reporting. It's natural to see self-reporting as something to avoid. It's a hassle and draws the attention of the oversight entities and the public, and there's a sense that nothing good can come of it, except that it's required. But it's useful to remember that the point of what the oversight entities do, like the point of what the IACUC does, is actually to support and demonstrate the ethical conduct of research, and the self-reporting is a component of transparency, which is a key part of that process. Demonstrating ethical behavior is related to building trust, and in this case, trust that those who do research with animals are doing the right thing. For various reasons, that trust has been falling over the past 50 years, and it's now somewhere around 50-50 between those who do and those who don't trust the people who do the research. Some of this has to do with the public not getting enough information about research with animals, what it really involves, why is it necessary, what good it does. Rebuilding trust that has been lost is very challenging, but getting more information out to the public is part of the process. But to build trust with that information, the information has to be unbiased, which means it has to include the warts. And the reality is that things do go wrong. We've got humans involved in this process of research. Humans make mistakes, and research inherently involves risks and the unknown. So it's important to keep in mind that when, not if, something goes wrong, between Murphy's Law and the various open records laws, someone will find out. And it's only a question of how they find out and when. Self-reporting is our chance to have some say in the how and the when. When we don't self-report, it contributes to an impression of covering things up, which undermines trust. When we do self-report, we get to provide the context and the corrective actions being taken. When we do it promptly, we demonstrate ethical behavior. So we need to keep in mind that self-reporting is not the same thing as turning ourselves in or self-incrimination. It's really more a matter of notification. Keep the oversight entities informed of what is going on so they can have your back and help with corrections and responses to the public. So I'll end with this figure again to remind us that although the IACUC and what it does are regulatory requirements, they are required as a mechanism for demonstrating to the public that the research with animals that we do is done ethically. Thank you very much. Back to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Alice. That was great. I always look forward to Alice's talks because she always has figures and flowcharts that make it really easy to understand. That was extremely helpful. Thank you. And our last talk, we will turn to Dr. Catherine Bain, the CEO of AAALAC International.
Thank you. I'd like to thank FASEB for inviting AAALAC to participate in this webinar. I'm going to take the next several minutes to discuss 3 main points. First, for those who find our industry filled with confusing acronyms, I will elucidate the differences between the IACUC's oversight role and that of AAALAC International. Second, I will review the fundamentals and commonalities of accreditation systems, and there are systems of accreditation for numerous industries. And third, I will leverage the general discussion of accreditation systems to the specific process of AAALAC International's accreditation for animal care and use programs. Next slide. In the last FASEB webinar, you learned about 2 critical oversight agencies for US-based animal research, OLAW and the USDA. These federal agencies have policy and regulatory responsibility for the welfare of research animals. From the 2 speakers today, Drs. Edwards and Huang, you have heard about the local oversight provided by IACUCs. Another key contributor to this interdigitating system of oversight is AAALAC's accreditation program. Each oversight process shares features, much like a Venn diagram, yet also is uniquely distinct. Next slide, please. AAALAC is frequently told that colleagues in the animal research community equate or confuse the role of the IACUC with that of AAALAC. So I thought it would be useful to illustrate the differences between these 2 oversight bodies. The IACUC is a local, internal oversight mechanism that does a deep dive. AAALAC International is an external assessment of the institution's systems and processes, which are validated by a detailed review conducted by our assessors. The IACUC provides oversight of the entire program. AAALAC conducts an assessment of the entire program for conformance with standards. The IACUC inspects facilities. AAALAC reviews facilities as well as their operation and the animals therein. The IACUC typically conducts these semis every 6 months, the semi-annual evaluation and the animal facility inspections. AAALAC typically reviews programs on site every 3 years. the IACUC has the authority to approve or suspend protocols, require corrective actions, and set timelines for correction, among numerous other activities. AAALAC determines an institution's accreditation status, and institutions voluntarily participate. Next slide, please. Possibly further contributing to the confusion regarding the differences between the IACUC and AAALAC is the acceptance by OLAW of an accreditation site visit or the pre-accreditation program status evaluation to serve as an IACUC's semi-annual program evaluation. To utilize one of these AALAC-related activities as a semi-annual evaluation, the IACUC must ensure that several provisions of the PHS policy and the USDA animal welfare regulations, as applicable, are met. The details for using the AALAC accreditation site visit as a semi are provided on the OLAW website in their FAQs under Program Review and Inspection of Facilities. This FAQ contains a hot link to the notice shown here. I've excerpted the relevant statement for reference, and it says, the provision to utilize ad hoc consultants may be invoked by IACUCs to make use of either of the two AALAC assessment programs or the pre-assessment preparation activities to meet the requirements for an IACUC semi-annual program evaluation and subsequent report. Next slide, please. I believe the distinctions of an international accreditation system will become more apparent over the course of the next few slides. So let's turn now to a discussion of the basics of accreditation systems, regardless of the industry. Following points have been made in several articles on this topic published in the peer-reviewed literature. Next slide, please. Accreditation is a highly effective tool for helping to introduce continuous quality improvement programs and processes to newly accredited or not yet accredited organizations. Also, they create new leadership within the organization for quality improvement initiatives. And accreditation results in increasing social capital by giving the staff the opportunity to develop collaborative working relationships, for example, with staff outside their own department. Next slide, please. Accreditation introduces organizational changes by promoting organizational learning through the application of accreditation standards. For example, staff are exposed to new documents within their organization, new literature that impacts their work. Accreditation also introduces organizational changes by helping to identify quality improvement initiatives. Accreditation aims to benchmark institutional performance against quality standards. Thereby, you're comparing your organization against industry standards, contemporary literature. Next slide, please. In my experience, accreditation promotes a strong institutional framework. Roles and responsibilities are clearly delineated, policies and procedures are understood, educational training systems are inclusive and well-functioning. Oversight and information support systems are established and refined, and assessment systems are established and meaningful. Next slide, please. These general outputs of accreditation systems also apply to AALAC's program. But more specifically, AALAC's oversight principles are based on the rules of accreditation, which are available on the AALAC website, and which state the institution shall observe any and all statutes and governmental regulations which bear upon animal care and use, and that the guide shall serve as the basis for the establishment of specific standards for accreditation. A second principle is the trust relationship, that the institution will be open and frank with AALAC about its program. Also, AALAC will validate the description of the program with a peer review. Next slide, please. Importantly, however, is AAALAC's accreditation system being rooted in science. AAALAC's founders recognized that a consistent, high level of research animal care would benefit science. And they recognized as well that input from scientists was needed. Next slide, please. AAALAC is a nonprofit organization. Our assessors work in the same environment as the institutions we evaluate. Importantly, AAALAC does not independently or arbitrarily establish standards or policies. Rather, AAALAC relies on scientific literature and consensus reports for its standards. The reason being that science is objective, verifiable, and a common language around the globe. Next slide, please. The AAALAC assessment process is a multi-layered review using a peer review approach. Each institution prepares a program description using a template from the AAALAC website that functions as an internal review. Next, an external review or site visit is done by AAALAC's representatives using a performance standards approach. The final layer review is accomplished through the deliberations of the Council on Accreditation. This last step results in a peer review of a peer review. Next slide, please. Like the tiered review process, AAALAC's standards are also layered, beginning with the fundamental requirement that the accredited institution complies with all applicable laws, regulations, and policies. Layered on this foundation are recommendations and standards derived from the scientific literature and expert guidance in consensus reports. These documents are referred to by AAALAC as reference resources and can be found on the AAALAC website. Finally, the core set of standards and expectations used by AAALAC are what we refer to as AAALAC's 3 primary standards. Next slide, please. These 3 primary standards are the 8th edition of the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, the 3rd edition of the Guide for the Care and Use of Agricultural Animals in Research and Teaching, and Appendix A from ETS 123. Each of these is also available on the AAALAC website. Next slide, please. You often hear reference to an accredited facility. For example, a journal article will say, the research was done in an AAALAC accredited facility. Actually, AAALAC does not accredit facilities. Rather, we accredit institutional programs of animal care and use. Referring to the definition of a program in the guide, you can see from this slide how encompassing the scope of accreditation is. For AAALAC, a program means the policies, procedures, standards, organizational structure, staffing, facilities, and practices put into place by an institution to achieve the humane care and use of animals in the laboratory and throughout the institution. Next slide, please. AAALAC's assessment of the animal care and use program includes all the elements depicted here, with the core concern being the high quality research animal welfare. Next slide, please. The scope and detail of AAALAC's review of the Animal Care and Use program is illustrated in part by the variety and depth of topics that must be addressed in the program description. This slide shows the table of contents for the template program description, which is used as a reference during the on-site assessment of the institution. I encourage you to go to the AAALAC website to look at the program description template in more detail. Next slide, please. This diagram shows the numerous steps to achieve accreditation, beginning with the application and completion of the self-evaluation component, achieved by preparing the institutional description of its animal care and use program, or as what we refer to as the program description. Then hosting the on-site assessment, which is conducted by one or more members of the Council on Accreditation and one or more ad hoc consultants. During the visit, they do a page-by-page review and discussion of the program description with institutional representatives. The site visit team evaluates the health and well-being of the animals, reviews the facilities and facility operations, including interviews with staff, and they assess how well the program's systems of internal oversight are functioning through discussions with the IACUC and review of program records and documents. Then the site visit team prepares a report of their observations. That report is reviewed and discussed by members of the Council on Accreditation, who subsequently take a formal vote on the accreditation status of the institution. That information is conveyed by a letter to the institution. Next slide, please. To summarize then, AAALAC International's accreditation program is a key component of the US's interdigitated oversight system. It shares some features with other oversight mechanisms, but with the added value that an accreditation system brings of continuous quality improvement, organizational learning, enhanced social capital, and the ability to benchmark against our ever-evolving industry. Thank you for your time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was great. I have to admit that I was guilty of being the one that mixed up IACUC and AAALAC in grad school. I was always wondering, why is IACUC coming again? And there's a big difference. So I really appreciate you walking us through that process. So now we are going to turn to questions. So as you can see on the screen, you just type in your question in the white box and hit send, and I will receive it here on my end. So let me open this up. And again, if we can't get through everything, I will collect all of the questions and distribute them to the speakers and post those questions and answers on the website for you to use as a resource. Okay, we have a question. What do you do to verify who is and what is proper training? Who does the training? I'm guessing this is for IACUC.
I can take that. The training, who does the training may actually vary depending on what the technique is. Some of the training may be a little more formal in a general review of what is expected for compliance with the law, the Animal Welfare Act and the Public Health Service. So that may be part of a, just really a PowerPoint presentation that explains the laws and why you need to follow the laws. More specific training may come from a veterinarian or a veterinary technician. A veterinary technician may demonstrate proper bleeding techniques. A veterinarian may help with surgical techniques. And finally, it could come from the principal investigator. Maybe there's a technique that's very specific to a laboratory that the investigator needs to teach to a student or technician. And the important thing here is that that training is documented. So if you're training someone in your laboratory, you need to document that you actually did that.
Gotcha. I agree, and I would like to add that this is one of those things that really relies on the judgment of the IACUC. It doesn't say in the regulations, what exactly the training should be, and it's not possible for the regulations to address that because it really depends on the individual situation, the individual procedures and protocols involved. But it is a charge to the IACUC to figure out what's reasonable for the particular situation and make sure that it happens.
Makes sense. Thank you both. Next question, can the IACUC chair duties and authority be reviewed? I'm not sure if that makes any sense. Okay, if the person that asked that question would like to follow up, we'd be happy to try and answer that. The current guide is 10 years old. When will a new one be published?
That's a great question. There's a lot to consider when you're thinking about revising the guide. I don't know, Catherine, are you?
Yeah, I think there's always conversations that occur about when is the right time. I know the last edition of the guide, they had hoped to make it a more living document that could go online, and there would be just updates to various sections as new literature dictated. I don't know if that plan will occur for the next version. They have to do fundraising for it. The community needs to help pay for that support, and to my knowledge, there has not yet been a concerted effort to initiate the fundraising and to even poll our community as to whether it's the right time to engage in developing a new ILAR guide. I probably should mention that there is a new ag guide that is complete, and I know, Galen, do you recall if it's available yet? But it is done. I know that they're seeking comments on it, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's in the seeking comment stage, but it should be out this calendar year.
Yep, so keep an eye out for that one.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the question about, revising the guide. I think many of us who work in this area realize there are parts of the guide that do need to be updated.
Right. Okay, does the traditional role of the attending veterinarian differ if they are a part-time consultant?
I guess I'm guessing that the question refers to, can you be a part-time consultant and still be an attending veterinarian? Yes.
That's my guess, yeah.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes, you can be a part-time consultant and still be the attending veterinarian. I've observed that commonly with small organizations where they have a part-time consulting veterinarian who is their attending veterinarian, who visits their facility on a pretty regular basis, but isn't there 100% of the time. Those facilities do have a mechanism to provide veterinary care, not necessarily by the named attending veterinarian, but they do have the requirement that they have veterinary care available, and that's usually arranged with either a more local veterinarian who may not be quite as versed in lab animal care as the attending veterinarian, or may not be versed in, it's usually with the regulatory oversight. So the clinical veterinarian that is there is very capable at performing the veterinary tasks, but may not be quite as versed in some of the regulatory oversight that the named attending veterinarian provides.
And if I might add, AAALAC has a position statement on the attending veterinarian and veterinary care. So if you go to our website, that lists all the duties, and our expectation is simply that if the veterinarian is consulting part-time, that there's assurance that the duties listed in that position statement are met by a competent named individual.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, the next question has to deal with something that I did prepare for. Would AAALAC consider postponing a 3-year site visit due to the COVID-19 pandemic? Some, if not all, facilities are limiting all unnecessary personnel from entering animal areas. I have, if you can see on the screen, some resources that may be helpful for you all. The USDA has provided a frequently asked questions. The NIH has been updating their website all the time. Today, OLAW just dedicated an entire webpage for COVID pandemic contingency planning, so I highly recommend checking that. And as well as the Department of VA has an FAQ. AAALAC has an e-brief and a telework policy, submitting all program descriptions electronically. So Catherine, if you wanted to speak to whether you're postponing site visits.
Be happy to. Yes, so the brief answer is yes, we are. And we're even considering right now how to handle the summer trimester, as this is such a moving target. But for now, as we mentioned in our e-brief, we encourage institutions to reach out to AAALAC and make that request, and we will work with you on an individual basis to accommodate the needs of our constituents during this very challenging time.
Great. Thank you. Yes, everyone. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. Okay, next question. How does the IACUC verify training for veterinary staff for study-specific tasks versus day-to-day clinical tasks?
I think that the clinical tasks, that this is part of the licensing and sort of the qualifications of a veterinarian, and then training for specific protocol-specific procedures or things like that. That again would be something that is up to the IACUC to use its judgment on. Obviously, the IACUC is not qualified to provide that training or to look at specific components of how a particular teacher teaches or something like that. But the IACUC would be in the position of saying, okay, this kind of a workshop sounds appropriate for this particular procedure, or looking at what the investigator proposes about visiting or inviting a consultant to come in and teach something that's only done by one or two labs. Yeah.
Yes, that's a situation where we do contact outside consultants to come in and verify that the technique is being done appropriately.
Mm-hmm. So this question is asking, as a senior IACUC member, what is their responsibility and why is it recommended they aren't DVMs?
The recommendation that they're not DVMs. While we like to have a lot of we do like to have non-DVM participation on an IACUC, we definitely need to hear the position of the scientific community. The IACUC also needs a non-scientist member. And so we want to have input from non-scientists to the protocol. I think as an IACUC chair, perhaps the most important people on our IACUC are community members, because they bring the opinion of the community, to the protocols that we're doing. Those of us who are scientists are often very enthralled with the science, and sometimes forget to look at where exactly what impact does this science have, and what is the long-term goal of this science. So it is very important to have non-veterinarians on the panel.
Right. It goes back to Alice's point during her presentation, where transparency is critical, and we're using public funds, and the public needs to understand everything that scientists are doing. Okay, I will take one more because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Can you speak about the use of ad hoc consultants to complete semi-annual inspections for non-USDA areas?
I'm sorry, you cut out just a little bit. Can I speak to the role of ad hoc consultants for what? I'm sorry, Naomi?
Sorry, to complete semi-annual inspections for non-USDA areas.
Oh, that's an IACUC. I'm sorry, I thought they were talking about AAALAC ad hoc consultants. So I'm going to pass that to Galen and Alice.
Yeah, I'll let Alice go ahead with this one.
No pressure.
Because this was in your slide set.
Pardon?
It was in your slide set.
Oh, yes. Well, so this is something that has become more has come more into our awareness because of the flexibilities that OLA has announced for the semi-annuals in this weird time that we're living. So the requirement for at least 2 reviewers for semi-annuals is a USDA requirement, and so that applies to parts of the program that have to do with USDA regulated species. If you don't have any USDA regulated species, then you need to do a semi-annual, but OLA, so the PHS policy actually is silent about how many or what kind of reviewers are involved. So especially now, OLA has emphasized that if you have just one person review the program and one person inspect the facility, that's fine. And they are actually allowing external, so non-member ad hoc consultants to do that. Of course, the important thing, that's going through the checklist. And so the important thing is then their findings have to be brought back to the committee. And so it's still up to the committee to look at those findings and decide what to do about them, and then decide how that, what that says about the program as a whole. But so OLA has always actually allowed that use of a single ad hoc consultant to perform the actual inspection or the review of the program. Obviously, you want somebody qualified. Somebody like an IACUC administrator might be a suitable person, or something like that.
Right.
And I would just add that ad hoc consultants are very valuable if you're dealing with non-traditional species, and you may not have someone on your committee that is particularly versed in amphibians or something, and to bring in an ad hoc consultant to join you on a visit can prove very valuable to that visit.
Right. Great. All right, so seeing the time, again, if we didn't get to your question, I will distribute these to the speakers and we will post them on the website. These slides and a recording of the webinar will also be posted, so stay tuned. That should be up in the next couple of days. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe. We look forward to seeing you later. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.